My name is Arthur Kovacs, and I am a psychologist. Uh, I will be talking to you today about a variety of things, but I want to prepare anybody who tunes in that this is probably going to be the first of a series of encounters where I take the lecture podium and I will be talking about topics that mean a great deal to me. I turned 89 this year, and the reason I'm doing this is because I feel it and believe very much in things that Ernst Becker has written in The Denial of Death, and other developmental psychologists have commented on at various points through the literature that I have consumed as part of my life. That is, as we approach death, many of us hunger for some kind of immortality project. It's as if none of us wants our lives not to have mattered very much. Right in water, you lift the finger out of the water, any trace of our having been here disappears. I have cherished my life. I still do. I hope I have a great deal of time beyond my 89th birthday to continue to immerse myself in the activities I will be describing along the way to you. But at the moment, of course, I have no guarantee I can live more than the next 2 minutes. And I tried to make peace with that as best I could. I've written many articles, I've given many lectures, I've put pieces of myself out in the world, but I happen to be the member of a peer consultation group. Two of its members are going to be here probably continuously, Dr. Scott Harris and Dr. Aaron Berger. But I've been joined by two more of our members, Dr. Sarit Ophir and Dr. Sherry Nader, who seem to have some crazy reason for wanting to be present today. And maybe at some later point they'll talk to you. Anyhow, Scott and Aaron came up with the idea one day when I was lamenting that I was going to die and I wished I could download the contents of my consciousness before I died. They came up with the idea that maybe I should download the contents of my consciousness before I died. And they developed this idea that I should talk for 1 hour each week on something that I cherished knowing about, something that I felt that I had something worthwhile to say. And we would just keep running through my brain for an open-ended period of time ahead until I feel like I had exhausted anything I remember, anything I believe in, anything I think about my own life or about our profession that might be of any interest to somebody else. And I have finally purged myself. I'm afraid to complete the task, though, because I might have to die then. that doesn't fill me with good feeling. But anyhow, I will rise to the challenge. Aaron and Scott will be here every week. Other colleagues and friends will probably cycle in and out. So the format is going to be the following. I'm going to talk for 45 minutes. And at the end of 45 minutes, I'll spend 15 minutes more in a back and forth with whoever's been listening to me here on this Zoom program. The two colleagues who are watching over it and any guests who have shown up. And I'll answer any questions, take any comments, or try to do any kind of clarification that seems asked for me at that point. Now, with that said, let me say some more about myself. I got my degree, my PhD in psychology in 1958. That was 62 years ago. I'm coming up on my 63rd anniversary. And I have been practicing as a psychologist ever since. As I'm fond of saying, I practice and I practice and I practice, and I'm still struggling to get it right. And I have to make peace with the fact I probably will never get it entirely right. But I certainly have learned a lot over those years. I've also managed to do many things I'm proud of. I founded I'll take that back. That is too narcissistic. I helped as one of the founders of the country's first professional school of psychology. I served as dean of the Los Angeles campus for several years. And in my connection with the California School of Psychology, Los Angeles campus, I was privileged to teach many courses as well as my administrative duties. At this point in my history, I have probably at least 1,300 students that have taken at least one class from me or been supervised by me. And they're scattered all over the United States and even in several foreign countries at this point. I feel very pleased with that. I've also seen approximately 2,500 clients in my own personal practice, and that number is staggering to me. I have been part of trying to heal, interact with, respond to 2,500 different lives of people who trusted me with their secrets, came to me with their hurts, and hoped I could be some help to them. And I honor them too in what I'm about to say to you. I've done finally a great deal of volunteer work for the American Psychological Association, much of it quite interesting. I edited one of its better journals, and I had to learn about the politics of being an editor and the tactics of being an editor. I was chairperson of the committee of the association that oversees our lobbying efforts in Washington. I made many trips to Washington to talk to legislators trying to persuade them to support one or another piece of legislation. And I was charged for a period of time with an arrogant challenge. How could the American Psychological Association come up with a more rational healthcare delivery system for the United States that would take away all the pain and trouble and confusion and expense and craziness that goes on in the delivery of American healthcare, and bring some sane and rational system in place in the United States? As you are well aware, that turned out to be an impossible quest. I pursued it for 5 years with the best brains in the association, and we gave up. It seemed like it was politically impossible until at least the year 2050. I hope I was wrong and something will happen sooner now, but I'm not sure I was wrong. Be that as it may, I gave up all my travels to Washington. I decided to combine simply my family, my friends, some other loved ones, my clients, and a few of my colleagues, the ones I interact with every week. And I'm at home now. I don't go venturing for great projects and great quests anymore. I've given it up. My life is much simpler now and much more rooted. So that's my preamble of introduction to myself. And now I will start on a substantive topic. It's again kind of egocentric. It's about two competing streams. How did psychology become, and how did I become a psychologist? Both of those streams, I think, are very important. And I used to teach the history of psychology, so I'm pretty aware of the landmarks I'm pointing to here. Talk about myself first, because stories are always more interesting than facts. Here's my story. For my 50th birthday, I contacted my middle sister. My eldest sister died very young, but my middle sister, of course, was still alive. She is 7 years older than I am, so she was 57 at the time. She had grumbled to me intermittently in our phone conversation that something was sticking to her, and she felt troubled about something. She couldn't identify it. She didn't know what it was. And so I'm a psychologist. I listened to her and I said, I remember something that I knew got stuck in you, and I don't know if it's ever been rectified. I said, you did not shed a single tear on the day our father died. I was 12, you were 19. He died suddenly in the middle of the night. You never cried. We went off stoically. You were even making jokes. We went off to his funeral. I didn't cry that day. You didn't cry that day. And we came away from the cemetery, and to the best of my knowledge, you've never shed a tear for the fact that our father died when you were only a teenager. I said, how would you like to make a trip back to Western Pennsylvania, and you and I will go visit our father's grave again? I said, that's had a lot of meaning to me. I finally started crying when I was in graduate school. I was 26, and I looked at a calendar, and I reminded myself this was the anniversary of my father's death. And when I whispered that to me for the first time in all those years, 14 years, I started sobbing. And I couldn't stop crying for at least 2 hours. And I've been crying about that frequently. I still think as I move through life, I may start crying now, as a matter of fact. My father died when I was 12, and it left a horrible wound and a hole in my life. When I turned 47, I got scared, I said to my sister. I was coming up on the age when my father had died. He died at age 48. I was 12. And I was convinced I was going to die when I turned 48. And for some reason, I thought it would be helpful to go back to his grave, because I hadn't been back there since I was 12 either. And it's a long and complicated story about how I finally found out when he was buried. I made a visit to the grave, but I did do that. And it was very meaningful to me. I talked to him a lot, all the things I didn't say before. He seemed to have changed for me. I was moving on in my life. He seemed to have become almost like my child. I was apologizing to him about the terrible things that went on in his life. I was talking to him about how I think his heart attack might in some ways have been almost a suicide. And I didn't blame him for leaving, because his life was intolerable. And I'm sorry I was too young to do anything or to appreciate it then, but I certainly do now. I can understand the burdens he was carrying and the impossibility of his life. And I told him what a cruel joke it was, that there was a double headstone there with my mother's name on one half of it, but she was not buried there. She went on to start a new life in Southern California, and she would never be with him. She had married somebody else. She had already died, and she was buried in a different place. She was never going to be there by his side. And maybe that was okay, because they had a troubled, problematic marriage. It was now very apparent to me. It's part of my conversation I had with him. In addition, I said, you have really been screwed. Look who's lying around you. You have, your parents are buried here near you. Your widowed sister is buried here. 3 of her children are buried here. And my mother's parents are buried here. And you had to support all those people. You had to earn the money to keep them alive while you were alive. That was part of the stress that killed you. And now you can't even get away when you're dead. You're buried in the middle of them. Still, I'm really sorry. I feel like picking you up out of here, getting an exhumation order, and reburying you somewhere else where you can live in peace. So I was telling my sister this story about what I experienced and how meaningful it was for doing what Gestalt therapists say, finishing unfinished business. And would she be willing to come back to the gravesite with me and visit him too? So that's how I'm starting this. I did that mission back with my sister, and it was very, very meaningful to me. It was based on things I had learned in school and practical experiences I had had, my opening to her and wanting her to come with me. So that's a story about me as a beginning psychologist. I had been in practice for some years then. I had some wisdom about things because of my practical knowledge, but I will save how I became a psychologist and what kind of psychologist I became, either for later today, if I could begin that narrative, or some other time. Because in order for me to become a psychologist, there had to be something called psychology that I could become and earn a living doing. So how did there come to be a profession of psychology? Originally, the wise people in a culture named themselves philosophers. There were no psychologists before the birth of Christ, or even for a long time afterward. It took a long time for psychology to be born. But beginning about 200 years before the birth of Christ, there were people who, if you asked them who they were philosophers. They would self-declare themselves as that. What does psychology mean? It's a translation from the Greek meaning love of wisdom. That's what a philosopher is. Somebody who searches for and loves recognizing and passing on wisdom. And the early philosophers like Aristotle and others, they would have their own teaching seminars. They would attract young people around them, and they would try to pass on the wisdom they had arrived at by following their particular philosophical bent and their disputations with other people that they know. It wasn't a long time until even philosophy itself congealed as something that people did. It required the founding of universities before there were philosophers who were actually employed as professionals who taught some kind of content and passed it on to students. I did some research and practice for today, and the first university in the world was the University of Bologna. It was founded in 1058, and it did have faculty who were called themselves philosophers as members of the teaching faculty. And I will apologize. We are so culture blind. I know a lot about the developments I'm talking to you about, but it's only developments in the Western societies. I know nothing about how wise people came to be, how they started creating training institutions in Africa, and on the continent of Asia, or in other places in the world. All of us are culture blind and very limited in our understanding of how the world came to be. Maybe one day we'll correct that. I never took a course anywhere in Asian history. It was not required of me. I don't know how many Americans have ever taken a course, either voluntarily as a hobby or in a college campus, on the history of Asia, even less the history of Africa. We are totally tuned out to how those cultures develop. I know enough to know that the wise people were usually attached to some religious movement. They were the priests of some religious movement who taught the contents of the belief system, and as well what a moral life was and all the great questions philosophers have answered. But finally, in our country, starting with the founding of the University of Bologna, the teaching of philosophy started to be separate from any particular religious orientation. Of course, the Jesuits and other religious people and the Talmudic scholars, they went on teaching philosophy of life as a branch of some kind of theology. But the split took place in 1058, where there were people who didn't necessarily subscribe to any theological orientation, but still wanted to know what the good life was, what is moral, what has value, how should people treat each other, and they were doing it in the context of disputations and arguments and life experiences, rather than the teaching of any biblical or other kind of concatenation of archived religious thought. And the movement went on. By the 19th century, there were universities all over the place, and almost all of them had departments of philosophy. They had professors who taught philosophical matters and students who were signed up to learn from them. And it was although many of them had deep religious views that they would talk about. But the Department of Philosophy in the universities was not limited to any particular theoretical religious orientation. The Reformation had happened, though, and the Renaissance had taken place by the 18th century, and there was the rise of an entirely different movement in our society coming to the foreground. And the fact that there was a scientific method, that scientists asked questions and wanted to collect some kind of empirical data to answer their questions, and had a ritual of what kinds of questions you should ask, how you should frame the search for answers, was taking on shape more and more and more, and it even started to infest the departments of philosophy. There were philosophers now who were asking, because they were studying things that we now traditionally study as psychologists. How do people learn? Are people a blank slate when they're born? And do they then have experiences? And their experiences leave traces in them somehow. And that's what learning is. What are the theories of learning? How do people learn? Memory was being studied by the philosophers. What is memory? How does it happen? What are feelings? Descartes believed that the pineal gland secreted feelings. That's what feelings were. They were a physiological reaction somewhere in the body. And so, wonder of wonders, certain philosophers decided they would try to answer their questions empirically instead of debating each other or referring to things they could point to in their own experiences. So they started data collection of one sort, And they considered themselves scientific philosophers rather than ordinary philosophers. And great disputations arose in the departments of philosophy. If there's one thing sure about human behavior is we're resistant to change. And the powers that be thought these people were heretics. They had given up philosophy. They were doing some perversion of something, and they didn't deserve to be philosophers anymore. But the movement kept gaining force, particularly in Germany and in the United States. And more philosophers were turning to empirical studies. And I do not know who the person was who said, we need to change our identities. Maybe the chairpersons of our departments are right. We are not philosophers anymore. Maybe we need a new name because of how we work and what we do. I know what, I'll call ourselves psychologists. And that's what we should start calling ourselves. So psychology means the study of the soul. That's what psychology means, translated from the Greek. And that's what these eminent professors thought they were doing. They were studying with scientific method the human soul. And so now we had some people in the department who said, I'm a psychologist, but they weren't getting adequate attention. They were still taking a lot of crap from the other people in the department. They had sold their birthrights. And slowly, they started to form departments of psychology to get the university administrators to let them leave the halls of the philosophy department and start up a separate new discipline called psychology. That's a really important turning point in how something was being prepared that I could make a living and enjoy. We can move on from the 1870s and 80s, where now a large number of people started to join departments of psychology and could go on with learning, was learning based on insight. Curler was working with his monkeys, and if you put monkeys in a cave and put bananas outside and put a bamboo pole in the cage, some monkey is bright enough to go scrape at the bamboo and bring it into the cage and eat it, even though nobody's ever shown the monkey how to do that. And then it gets even more complicated. If you give 3 poles of bamboo in of short length, but they'll fit into each other, some monkey will learn how to stick them together and reach even a more distant banana with a longer pole. Now, nobody's taught them anything. How does this take place? So that's the kind of studies that were going on. Memory was being studied. Learning was being studied. Sensation and perception were being studied. Many things that still are part of the interests of psychologists. In 1894, psychology professor Lightner Whitmer at the University of Pennsylvania was approached by, was approached by the Philadelphia Board of Education. Whitmer himself had a lab that was studying human learning, and the Board of Education had heard about that, got in touch with Whitmer and said, we're not sure what your expertise is about. We know you're studying human learning. We have a whole bunch of students enrolled in the public school system who seem to labor much more than other students with learning new material. Is there anything you and your laboratory assistants could do that would help us understand what these students need and would contribute to giving them a better education? And he said, I don't know. Let me think about whether I can take this on. And the school administration gave him permission and some funds to start what was called the Clinical Center in the University of Pennsylvania. So suddenly there was a psychology clinic for the first time. And a psychology clinic is a place where people go to meet with learned professionals and to get some help for practical life problems. This was the first time that was tried in 1894. And Lightner Whitner would go around giving lectures to his colleagues about what he was struggling to do. And he kept calling it, I'm applying the clinical method to the problem in psychology. I'm inventing and applying the clinical method in psychology to human distress, at least one form of human distress. Not much happened. He didn't get very far, and nobody else seemed to be following in his footsteps. It took several more years. In 1896, Freud published studies in hysteria. I don't think psychology departments paid much attention to it, but the general publics, the intelligent, educated general publics in many places in the world started to pay attention to what Freud was thinking about and writing about. And it was a heretic notion. It turned the mind-body problem, and that's a great issue in philosophy. What is the relationship between the mind and the body? And most people come down on the side is the body is preeminent. All our thoughts are nothing but the firing of neurons. All our feeling states is the secretion of hormones of one sort or another. The body is preeminent, and the mind is like froth on top of the waves. Freud was turning everything upside down. He dared to suggest that strange body problems, hysterical paralysis, hysterical anesthesia, many things that the body was doing was not the result of anything the body was doing, but it was the result of repressed traumatic memories. It was a mental phenomenon that had gotten blocked somehow and was not allowed to flow to completion, and the body was what was reverberating to the difficulty in some way. It was really hard for his colleagues to swallow that notion, and they derided him, they attacked him, but he persevered. And in 1904, when another great thing happened, he published studies in The Interpretation of Dreams. That's the correct title of the book. In it, he advances another proposition that dreams are not meaningless, affluence on the surface of the brain functions in the night. Dreams are meaningful. Dreams come from a portion of the self that has been blocked off, but it is symbolic representations of lost stories the self is trying to tell itself. And the stories come up in the form of dreams, like they're fairy tales and metaphors of one sort or another. And the dream is always very powerful and meaningful. He went on in his last chapter to publish Towards a Scientific Psychology. He again chimed in on the mind-body problem, and he tried to describe what the neurons in the body were doing that were coincident with what was happening in hysteria and in dreaming. What were the neural mechanisms that might explain these, but still might be consistent with his theory that these were meaningful things, and that the correct intervention was through talking of some kind, through retrieving parts of the personality that had been lost. It wasn't a physical intervention, even though we could see the physical sites that were back post talking. Still, the second book too was a horrendous shock to the most of the learned people of the time. Now, he made a terrible mistake. He was wanting his ideas to spread as widely as he could spread them beyond Germany and Austria. He had managed to get English followers, and he had one American psychiatrist who had come to Germany to learn about him and study with him in the early 1900s, a man named A.A. Brill. He spent about 6 months with Freud, listening to his lectures and listening to his comments about work he was doing. And he himself had an experimental analysis. And Freud liked that somebody from America had cared enough to come be with him. So he asked A.A. Brill if Brill would be his interpreter of the book, The Interpretation of Dreams, because he had gotten a feeling from a publisher that maybe the publisher would publish it, an American publisher, but he needed to translate it into English. So he gave the rights to the American translation to Brill, and the Brill estate still holds the right. Well, I'll return to my own story. One of the experiences that readied me for thinking about the possibility, but only for 2 seconds, of doing something in the field of talking to people to remediate their distress was my buddy, Howard Goldman, my best buddy. He said, "Oh boy, do I have something for you." "Well, what do you have for me?" I got a book that's full of dirty words, he said. You got to read it. Oh, I said, a book full of dirty words? That sounds interesting. What's it called? I said, I'll write it down. He says, it's the Interpretation of Dreams. Well, who wrote it? Somebody named Sigmund Freud. Can I get a copy somewhere? And I went to Los Angeles High School. There was a branch called the Memorial Library right across the street, run by the city. It was a memorial to LA High students that had died in World War I. But we did have a branch library for grown-up books right across the street from the school. He said, I think you can get it across the street. I said, oh boy, I'm going to get it right after school. So I went after school. The librarian looked at me with great suspiciousness and said, what do you want? And I said, Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. She said, that's under lock and key. She said, I can't give it to you. I said, why not? She said, well, are you 18? I said, yes, I'm 18. She said, prove it. Do you have a driver's license? Fortunately, I had a driver's license I had forged in my darkroom many years ago because I wanted to go get liquor legally and buy cigarettes. So I showed her my phony driver's license that proved I was 18. So I had to sign a form, and I had to promise to bring it back the next day. I could only check it out one day at a time. So I went and I started turning pages. Cunnilingus, what the hell is cunnilingus? I would have to look it up in the dictionary. Masturbation, oh, I know what masturbation is. That's what we jack off. And I kept getting titillated by all that. He was actually writing something that has these out front in it. My God. It was hard for me to pay attention to his prose because I will tell you now, Brill did not speak German well, and this is a terrible text. It's turgid, it's ununderstandable, it's all fucked up. Many sentences don't make any sense at all. It isn't until Freud died and his estate gave Lytton Strachey, a British guy, the right to go over every one of Freud's papers and books that have been translated into English and clean them up and make a unified edition that would stand as his library for the rest of eternity. And the Strachey translation of The Interpretation of Dreams is beautiful. It reads like poetry. So I did understand two things from the book. I did understand that dreams had meaning, they were wish fulfillments, and I did look at the last chapter. I did understand he was trying to describe what the neural mechanisms of dream work was. And I thought that was a noble thing he was taking on. I didn't think he had done very well at it, but I believed back in 1904 when he had written it, he was really making a noble attempt at something that was precious. And I took it out for about 5 successive days. I identified all the dirty words in it. I masturbated once to some of his imagery, and then I moved on. I forgot all about that. I'm not sure that did much to prepare me to become a psychologist. Anything psychological went off my young radars. I finished my last 2 years of high school. But also in 1904, Alfred Binet published the Binet intelligence test. And now suddenly we had another scientific tool that was much different. It had obvious applications to human life. It was, in the long run, a test of the aptitude to learn. That's what it was. If you had a higher number, you could learn new material with greater facility and faster. And you could learn more complex material better, or maybe even learn even more complex material that other people with lower scores couldn't learn at all. This was a wonderful research tool. And it certainly started off all these psychologists, experimenters in new directions doing research with the Binet. And soon after the Binet, Strong invented a vocational interest inventory, and it helped guide people who took it into what fields of endeavor might be useful for them when they were picking careers. So more tools were being invented that were leading us even more in an applied direction and away from just being psychologists, philosophers who were having arguments without the scientific method. Whenever I teach this material, I always make a rueful observation. Wars do terrible things. I wish war could be abolished. But war is a terrific stimulus for certain kinds of leaps forward in various kinds of technology, because the one who wins the technology war can often win the actual physical war by developing weapons and ways of fighting that are far superior to anything the opponent has. The most powerful illustration of that is the invention of the atomic bomb at the end of World War II. At any rate, the government turned to all kinds of scientists. Could they help the war effort? And the ones that seemed to have the most promise were the psychologists. It was stupid to draft somebody who had a very low IQ and then try and train them to do anything. That was a waste of time. Just because they were in good physical condition didn't mean they were capable of serving in any useful capacity. The Army Alpha was invented. It was a short form of the Stanford, what's now called the Stanford-Binet test. And everybody who was drafted was screened to see if they had adequate IQ capability to make use of their basic training and any specialty training they might be given for other tasks, like could they become a radio operator and learn Morse code. After a while, the beta test was then brought online. That was a test of aptitudes again. What military specialties should we direct the draftees in? That was very rudimentary. That didn't get very far before the war ended. But already psychology had proved itself very useful in time of war, and it goaded psychologists to think about what other applications were out there. Soon after the war, because psychologists have gotten used to talking to administrators of large projects, they started nosing around in the industrial sphere. What is it they could do for big employers? Was there anything they could develop or any intervention they could make? And the beginning birth of what we now call industrial organizational psychology started to be stimulated in the 1920s. It led eventually to the Hawthorne effect that wasn't clearly recognized until the 30s. I hope every student of psychology is asked about the Hawthorne effect, because it's usually on licensing exams. That's one of the questions. The Hawthorne effect, in a way, is mind-boggling. Hawthorne, Pennsylvania is the site of a General Electric plant, and the managers there, a very large plant, employed a few thousand workers. Some psychologists were employed to come study how the plant functions and come up with some recommendations that might make the workers more productive, so that the number of gadgets or light bulbs or whatever that plant was producing that came off the assembly line by the end of the day would be greater, because this intervention had been made. So they tried all kinds of things. They tried to screw around with the pace of the assembly line, workers. They played music. They tried different colors on the wall. They changed the lighting. And much to their surprise, everything they changed led to a small increase in the productivity of the workers. And the more they changed, the greater was the productivity. And it wasn't until the 1930s where some kind of overarching research was done, and the real important variable was the workers thought the management cared about them. These were all signs that the management cared and were trying to make their life better. So whatever management tried, it improved their morale and their productivity. I think that's a wonderful thing. That's the Hawthorne effect. It's related very much to the placebo effect in medicine. We're going to give you something that's going to help you. And it helps. All right. What was happening as a result of all the ferment in trying to find ways to apply psychological knowledge to real-world problems was that there was a growing number of people who weren't paying attention to their academic pursuits anymore. There was an armamentarium of things that people could get paid to do. They didn't have to develop anything new. There were some things out there that could already be supplied. There were tests that could be supplied. There were interventions in the workplace that could be supplied. So more and more psychologists actually moved off the college campuses, opened offices of consulting services of one sort or another, and began to earn their living not as teachers and researchers, but as applied psychologists who offered services of one sort or another. And with every passing decade, on into the 30s and on into the 40s, that movement became more and more robust, people leaving the college campus. By the early 30s, the year I was born, there were approximately 1,200 people who belonged to the American Association of Applied Psychology. They had already also joined the American Psychological Association, but they were unhappy with the attitude they were getting from the American Psychological Association. APA, the big APA, was not granting them much program time. Actually was engaged in the two cultures problem that's gone on everywhere in academia. Those who do research and are the scholars who teach have contempt for those who make a living with some applied form of what they've learned about. Those are money grubbers. Those are not real scholars. Those are second-class citizens. And there's real tension and hatred between the two camps. And so the American Psychological Association was very stingy in recognizing the contributions to our culture of those who are applying and being paid fees for applying psychological knowledge, gave them only skimpy program time, would not let them publish journal articles. The poor applied psychologists had to start their own journal and hope that other people would read it. And so the two were on a collision path across from each other. And that's where we are in 1930s, the year I was born. Now I will come back to my life. I learned something else that affected me in the year, not in the year I was born, but about the year I was born and how I came to occupy a place on the planet. In that same trip I took to Pittsburgh to my father's grave with my sister, I don't know if I mentioned before, she did actually start crying, and it was very good for her. We were there for a couple days, and we had plenty of time. We started sharing memories that we had never talked about to each other. So each of us had part of the family history in us that the other had never heard, and she certainly had the family history before I was born, pieces of it that I had never heard because I wasn't alive to hear them. And she taught me things, too. She taught me about the problems in her upbringing. One of the things she told me was, I was a restitution child. And I said, what the hell does that mean I was a restitution child? She said, our mother had a child in between me and you. There's 7 years difference. Well, there was another child who was 3 years younger than I was. She did not want that child. She had been very unhappy after I was born. She felt tired. She felt like she had enough children. But my father was furious because he didn't have a son. And he demanded that she try again. She had to at least try one more time to give him a son. And they fought and fought and fought. And she was finally exhausted and gave in. And she did get pregnant again. And then she felt so terribly miserable. She knew she could not stand caring for another child. She had made a mistake. She had allowed him to browbeat her into this decision. And she secretly went and had an illegal abortion. She was going to lie to him and tell him that she had had a miscarriage. But she had an abortion. And she felt so terribly guilty. My father was stricken. He was so miserable that the child was lost. He started to browbeat her again, that she had to get pregnant again as soon as she recovered from the after effect of the miscarriage. And she was in a miserable, miserable, unhappy bind. So she asked our family physician, is there somebody she could talk to who had some wisdom about this? Our family physician said, yes, there is a very good alienist I could send you to. Now, what became the profession of psychiatry back then was named the alienists back in the 1930s. They didn't change their name until close to 1940 and become psychiatrists. Why were they called alienists? I don't know. I think they believed that people were in trouble because they were alienated from some part of themselves, and that the alienist had to help heal the breach that was keeping them cut off from something significant in themselves. At any rate, My mother went, and with my hindsight, as I listened to my sister, I understood that he must have been an Adlerian therapist because he told her the reason that she was suffering was she had an insufficiency of social interest. That's Adler's prime pronouncements. What is social interest? It's being altruistic. It's being less than egocentric. It's coming back into a better balance so there's more altruism. And she had committed a terrible attack on my father with the abortion. She had misled him twice. She had agreed to something she couldn't carry out. And then she had committed a lie and an abuse of her own body and something that was immoral. She had taken another human life. And the only way forward was she had to atone. That's what she had to do. She had to get pregnant again and provide him with a child. She could not persuade her body that it was going to be a male, but she had to make a good faith attempt. She had to apologize to him. She had to confess that she had had an abortion and set the record straight, and she had to try to get pregnant. Well, it took 4 more years, but here I am the restitution child. And at that moment, my mother had a terrible postpartum break that lasted for 3 years. And I will stop on that note. I always like leaving cliffhangers. So that's it. Anybody can talk now. Who wants to start? Don't rush.
Arthur, who was the most important person that influenced your development or the development of your professional identity, and why?
Oh, that's in the story for next week. I stumbled across at the end of high school James Bugenthal, who became one of the founding forces in the existential humanistic movement in our field. I met him in my last year of high school under strange circumstances. But it was almost like fate was beckoning to me in some way. And he and I became not only mentor and student, but good friends for a lifetime after that. Anybody else?
Did you stay friends with the kid who told you about the interpretation of dreams?
Yes, I did. I'm really sorry our lives have taken us apart. We moved in different circles. We liked each other because there was an intellectual affinity between us, but he was filthy rich and I was not. His father was a guy that invented what's called the drip cut. It's that glass bowl with the chrome thing on top where you pull the trigger back and you pour syrup out of it, and there's a matching sugar dispenser. He had invented that in the late 1930s, and he sold millions and millions of them all over the world and became filthy rich. And my best friend moved to, what's the fancy suburb of Santa Barbara? Montecito, yeah. He moved to a mansion in Montecito. And he went to college on the East Coast. I think he went to Harvard. And he learned to fly his own airplane. He took over the family business. And we just didn't have space or time. I went away to Ann Arbor to graduate school. So our paths diverged after high school. But I still think with him with fondness. Oh, he was so rich, he got the first MG Roadster that was imported into the United States. I was so jealous. He would show up in high school in this beautiful Roadster, and oh my God, I hated him at the same time I loved him.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Any other questions?
More
very, very well done. Very well done. I feel like I've been educated.
Good.
Absolutely.
Good. You learned some things you didn't know before.
Yeah,
I think it went very smoothly.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, when you were talking, I noticed some of the people in our group, had you as a professor and as a teacher, and I never did, so I'm actually lucky now to do that. I feel like I'm in a classroom.
You can come
That's
anytime and hear whatever I'm talking about.
Excellent. Thank you. It was lovely.
I like how you were able to weave, your own personal experiences with the history of psychology.
Well, they begin to converge even more and more as I get older.
Mm-hmm.
I found my way onto a moving sidewalk that carried me to my future without ever expecting to do it. I'll make one last comment today. My hero in high school was Dave Essick. He was my physics teacher. I was very good in both physics and chemistry, and he was a ham radio operator, and he had a ham radio club after school. So I, of course, joined his club, but he was my symbolic father because my father hadn't died, and he saw great promise in me. And as I was moving towards the end of my high school education, I was torn. I had two possible careers, and I couldn't decide between them. I was either going to be a novelist or a nuclear physicist. Those were my two choices, and I didn't know what the hell to do to proceed. My writing teachers had always liked my writing and encouraged me to do more. And Mr. Essick loved my performance. I got almost straight, all correct answers on almost. I took both basic and advanced physics from him. And I think I only missed one question on any of his exams. I just ate that stuff up. And here it was in the aftermath of World War II. What was the most powerful and romantic career anybody could go through? Nuclear physics. That's where the future of the world was. And so I was going to get on board that bandwagon. And that's where I'll stop and tell you how I got off the bandwagon.
Well, that sounds very good. I think that would be a very interesting transition to hear about for sure.
All right.
I'm kind of curious what novel you would have wrote.
I know now. I wasn't sure what novel I was going to write back then. But I certainly have at least one right now. And I have it written as a screenplay. It probably should be a novel.
Okay, we'll have to add that to the list of things to do.
All right, I'm going to click leave, and as I understand it, it will start screwing around with the recording and make me my recording at this point when I leave.
Yep.
Okay, bye. Oh,
wait, do we need to organize for next week?
Is this time okay? I can do it the same time next week. Is this a bad time? I'd like a time that both you and Aaron can come consistently, and then any guest that would show up if they're interested and able.
This time is fine for me. Aaron?
Yeah, this works great for me. I've already penciled it off for next week.
Okay, we will get together again same time next week.
Okay, and you'll have to actually you've told us the topic. Is that not right?
Yes.
Okay.
It's about how I moved into a greater connection with psychology and came finally to the conclusion that I should be a psychologist.
It wasn't about kind of like the graduate school or graduate schools in psychology?
That comes later.
Okay.
I haven't even gone out to graduate school yet. How did I decide I wanted to go to graduate school?
Stop making me grow up so fast, Scott.
So becoming a psychologist.
Deciding to become a psychologist.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, learning more about psychology and deciding to become a psychologist.
Okay.
And then what? Also, the backstory will go on. What happened to the years of psychology from that year of my birth in 1931? What was it that I was starting to aspire to join? What had psychology evolved into by the late 1940s?
Okay. Great. Very good, Arthur.
All right. Talk to you next week.
All right.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Next week. Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you for doing this.